if there were sort of two pathways that you saw, two trains running, so to speak, it might be interesting. Here I am. I'm probably doing a Bible quiz practice, studying, memorizing verses, and learning about how good girls behave, and then out there in the world there are these strong women saying, no, we should have equal pay.
Equal rights who? I don't think so. Welcome to A Generational Thing podcast. I'm your host, Natalia Latham.
Hi, I'm Angela Latham, also your host.
This lovely host, Angela Latham, is my aunt.
Yes, and this is, of course, my lovely niece, and that's the kind of math we do here.
That is, as smart women, this is math. Oh, boy.
This first episode is just really the start of this journey. We'll be approaching this episode by lobbing questions at each other, frankly, over the next little while. The questions we've chosen to ask each other and talk about are ones that we hope will clue you in on who we are and what brought us here to this point, this moment together, and some of the things that matter most to us. We hope by talking about these things, we're being transparent about what you can expect in this world that we are trying to create through A Generational Thing podcast.
And with this being our first episode, for all of our lovely listeners out there who may not know us, just to break the ice here, what are some things that we should know about you if we were just to meet you for the first time?
So, sort of like imagining ourselves in a situation where we've accosted each other, we don't know each other. If I were to just be trying to give you the facts about myself that might help you get to know me, I would say a few things. Usually, I guess people start with a bit of demographics. Geography might not even hurt. I grew up in Indiana mostly. It makes me a Hoosier, but I did also do a stint in my childhood as a missionary's kid and a preacher's kid. I lived in the Philippines for 6 years, and that was because, my parents had work to do as part of their church endeavor. I ended up living I've lived mostly in Illinois throughout my career, and I've lived also in Wisconsin and Texas, but my roots are really Hoosier because that's the majority of my childhood. And yeah, academically, that's a big area for me. I always loved school, and in my post-secondary education, I studied first speech, and then I moved into theater as an academic discipline and ultimately studied that very extensively. But I left a long career last year as a theater professor. I had worked for many years doing that and decided I wanted to take some time and shift things and do some things that I had put off that I'd wanted to do, reach some goals that I had set for myself that had been hard to do. And so now I'm a free spirit in that regard. I'm not tethered to a particular employment, although I keep very busy. I write nonfiction. A lot of my earlier writing is more historically based, exploring American theater, particularly performances by women in the early 20th century. More recently, I've been experimenting with memoir. And then as far as a few other things I would want to tell you, I think if we didn't know each other right away, I would want you to know that I'm a mom. I'm a mother-in-law, hopefully one that is not, disliked. I think I have a really good relationship with my daughter-in-law, and I'm really proud of her. And I am in the family known as Grangie, which is obviously means I'm a grandmother, but we've converted my name Angela to, and often I was called Angie as a child and still am. So I'm Grangie. And I forgot to say from the get-go, girl, Uncle Al says hi.
Oh, well, hey on back there to Uncle Al.
So So,
Well, I guess not really just hey, more specifically, hey girl.
oh yes, right. He loves our lingo on that. Yes,
He
and
really
especially
does.
to be so included, right? But
Exactly. As one of the girlies.
right. Well, what about you? Let's flip this here, and I would like to ask you about yourself. And what would you say for yourself?
Well, where do I even begin? Let me first say, what a wonderful elevator pitch, Miss Girl. I also am an Indiana native, a Hoosier girl, if you will, born and raised in the Terre Haute, Indiana region, and stayed in that area until I graduated high school from my class of about 200, if that says anything about the area. But yeah, I just graduated this past May from Ball State University. Just a hop, skip, and a jump from my roots, about 2 hours away in Muncie, Indiana, where I graduated with a double major in theater and art history. Originally, I went there with just theater in mind, but then whenever I took a class, just an introductory level art history class, I was like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I think this might actually be the way to go.
Yes.
And I can definitely say that I've stuck with that, being that now, post-graduation, I have begun working in an art and antique and jewelry auction house. It's literally, well, at this point in my life, my dream job, but it's also quite dangerous for me because it's hard to walk away from an auction without getting something, especially if it's something within the realm of, well, I guess I haven't been able to afford these such things, but even just being in the same area, vicinity of artists that I've learned about in class and everything has just been a really wonderful experience. So yeah, that definitely has helped me out there a lot. But outside of work, I am in fact a single mother to a beautiful little boy. You might be hearing in the background now. And let me clarify, he is a four-legged creature, a little cat named Sawyer. And he's staring at me longingly now, yearning for some pets. But anyway, yeah, outside of that, I guess I feel that is important to myself now is that I've reached a point in my life where I'm really feeling and learning and starting to come into my own independence as a young woman who doesn't have the responsibility of school and homework after all of that, and just being able to live independently as a working woman has been, I don't know if this will make sense, but just kind of a big part of my identity. I feel like now just having that level of independence has been really liberating for me. So yes. I am loving that. But one other brief thing, if I may say, that I feel like says a lot about myself. So I'm a girly with a lot of questions, which I guess is another great thing about this podcast. I know you and I both probably have the experience of just having a lot of questions about the world and wondering how things work and the meaning and symbolism and all of that kind of stuff. That is something that really drives me, I feel like, to understand the world at large.
Yes.
Especially through the lens of art, I find myself experiencing a lot. So yeah, there's my elevator pitch.
That's great. No, I think it's helpful for us to be transparent about who we are and how that shapes what we're going to talk about for the future, and certainly in this episode as well. And it's especially important because of our different ages, and yet we do have some shared history as well. But we will build on that as we go. I'm curious. There's a little bit more that I'd like to talk about with regard to our backgrounds. I think it might be helpful if you could talk some about your family growing up, your nuclear family, if you will, and how you are obviously the bright shining light among them, and what makes you that in their presence. Maybe some stories about the origin of your family of origin, whatever you might feel comfortable talking about.
Yes. Well, to begin with, I am an only child. And people say that it shows, whatever that means. But I am, in fact, an only child to my sweet mother and father. My mom is an interesting story. Her country of origin is Colombia, South America, which is, the older I get, becomes more and more amazing to me. Understanding her history there and my heritage within that has been something I've really gathered interest in. And then I guess some people might say, my dad would say, and that's how I met your mother. But yeah, they met there. My dad was out there, also a Hoosier boy at heart, Indiana boy at heart, trying to, I guess, find his way. And luckily, he just stumbled across my mother. And then the rest, as they say, is history. But yeah, my mom and dad are still together, and they live in the same house that I have grown up in. And with I guess if we're speaking just nuclear family, that's about it for me. As I said, I am an only child. I have a huge extended family in Colombia, which I also take great pride in. So kind of sad for me to think about the fact that I can't really connect with them much. So
in terms of distance, you mean geographically? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, in terms of both distance, and also I slap myself on the wrist for not taking the time to fully learn Spanish in the way that I would like to communicate with them.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing, learning another language.
It really is.
Yeah.
I have so much respect for multilingual people.
I don't know how my mom does it. Actually I do. She's an amazing woman, but that's about it for my nuclear family. So I've talked about my mom's huge extended family in Colombia, but I've yet to talk about my dad's family, which you happen to know a little something about, being that you are his sister.
That's right. I've got a brother, and his name is Larry.
And that's my father. Thank you very much. Hey, Dad.
Yes. Yes. I'm also we're a family of three as far as my family of origin. There were two brothers older than me. One is Larry and another is Steve. And we all traveled to the Philippines together. We did those things I mentioned in some of my early comments as a family. They were 5 and 6 years older than me. So in many ways, I felt as the only girl and significantly younger. There were times when I too felt like an only child, especially given circumstances of being overseas, and they went off to boarding school at one point, and I was young enough to stay home, and things like that were different about our upbringing. But I was really taken with coming back to the United States, and I was first able to meet, at least as a point of memory, my dad's parents and my mom's parents. So, as far as that sort of origin story, the family lore you get, for me, it came vividly when I was about 7 years old, and we came back from the Philippines for the first time, and I met my grandmother, your great grandmother. And she was probably the most noteworthy member of the family. We talk about extended family that I met at that time, and who had a really big impact on me. And I didn't get to know her very long, all things considered, especially since I didn't spend the early part of my childhood in the United States. I went to the Philippines when I was 2. But Nellie Madge Latham was her name, and she was a school teacher. And there were things that I learned from her in that, really 1 year that we lived in close proximity, and then, over a few years before her health declined. There were so many things I learned from her that I still think of her almost, well, in the summer, I think of her almost daily, because every time I pick a dead petunia, she taught me about that sort of thing on the farm there. And that's, as far as thinking about family history, that stands out to me and is probably enough to go on for now. But, I've spent a lot of time in the house where you grew up because, ultimately my mother ended up and father lived there as well until he died. And then she died a couple of years ago and you grew up with them. And that will, I know, make its way into conversations later.
Yes.
The kinds of, relationships that developed between you and my parents and when I visited, my relationship with you and all those things we'll get into either a little bit later in this episode and also I'm sure in future episodes.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
If I may briefly just take it back to where you're talking about Nellie Madge, Little Miss
Sure.
Nellie Madge, and you talk about thinking about her in the summer because of these petunias.
Yes.
I feel that's such an interesting and precious memory and moment that you bring up because I have a similar feeling with my grandma, your mother.
Yes.
God bless her, Carolyn. I also feel like the memory of grandma for me comes up a lot in the summer because I'm always reminded of how she, if it was a beautiful day outside, you would know it because she would always say, "Oh, what a beautiful day it is today," or something along those lines,
Yes.
And
Right.
that's something that I have noticed or have just thought about over the course of the past few summers. So I think that that's a really lovely little connection that we share there with our own grandmothers.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for thinking of that. I remember that about my mother too. And when she visited me here, for example, in the home where I live now, she would always say those kinds of things on a nice day.
Yeah, what a beautiful day it is today. She was rarely wrong.
Yeah, she could not predict the weather, but describe it very well.
You have always been a consistent, reliable presence for me. I feel like the relationship that we have now has really blossomed in the past few years or so,
Yes.
even more so than it had before.
Right.
Especially maybe since I've turned 18. And these conversations that we have now are coming from a place of more maturity, life experience, shared experiences as women, perhaps even.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like you and I see a lot of ourselves in each other, and that is something, for me at least, has been very important to me, knowing that there's a woman who gets it in the way that I get it and feels things in the way that I feel things as well. You know what I mean?
I do. Yes. I remember when you started to have, for example, an interest in the arts, particularly theater at first, and being interested, watching that and wondering, I've taught theater long enough to know not to want to press that point with young people because it's not in and of itself often a career that ends well or begins well even sometimes. It can be a very challenging, depending on which branch of theater and type of theater you're working with. It can be a tough gig, literally, and not so much literally and if you're not prepared to do it and have the stamina and so forth. So I was aware of that shared interest, and yet was a little hands-off about it. I don't know if you noticed that, but as you got more serious about it, I then realized, no, this is coming from within her, and it's something she's drawn to. And then I saw you making choices even within the other art realms that you were studying, and that's I would just want to go ahead and say that as far as, yes, I do believe, as you've expressed, that our relationship has changed over the years and has grown much more deeply in the last few years, such that here we are even conceiving of doing some project like this together. I was just going to say, too, though, that when you think about the relationship between aunt and niece, I think what drew me in part to, what was developing between us is that I had a couple of aunts I had a relationship with that really meant a lot to me. The relationship itself and the who they were as people, the kinds of things they taught me specifically. And I think it's a unique kind of connection. It's different than the connection you have with your mother or even some other older female friend. And I just had always hoped that I could have that kind of connection as an aunt myself. So
Yes.
I was open to it. Yes, I was very open to what was developing, but you're right. It's taken us some time.
Yes. Is there a specific moment that stands out to you as a turning point?
I really noticed, you joked about it, but it's true that it seemed as though once you turned 18, you did get more interesting. And it wasn't a magic marker on your birthday, but there was something about getting to know you in situations other than with family. I found myself having more opportunity as you got older to talk with you outside of the context of, when I would go to visit my mother, your grandmother, and then be with her, and you were one of the people in that house, and your parents were there. That was a very different circumstance than to get to know you one-on-one in different settings. And I also, as you started to get into your college materials and your studies, you were sometimes having questions, and we dealt with some of the college questions that you had, whether subject matter wise or process wise, things that you came to me. Because I worked in the institution of academia, it was natural for you to reach out to me. And then, having overlapping interests. But I would say, as I mentioned before, you had started to come visit me once in a while, visit us. Actually, I remember, being together as a family group as well. But I remember the weekend you spent with me in the Chicago area as I was packing up my faculty office a little over a year ago, and we were just going to hang out in Chicago that weekend. And it was just really, I feel, a milestone sort of for me. Not that we hadn't already grown close. Otherwise, we wouldn't have even wanted to spend a weekend like that together, I'm sure. but the chance to go to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago and wander around the city together. And we went to, a Steppenwolf play and all the things that we did. And we saw the world sort of through each other's eyes in a different way through those experiences. For me, that was a real benchmark event in our relationship. So
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And very similar to what you're saying, for me, I also feel like a pivotal moment for our relationship blossoming into what it is now is whenever I was able to take trips to visit you by myself without the accompaniment of a parent or any other family being around, being able to talk to you about the hard shit out there. Not always, of course, our common interests in art and other things of that nature as well, but just getting to be like ourselves with each other without having to perform sister or daughter or anything else to other family around. I feel like that was a very special moment for us to be able to get to do things like that.
Yes, I think that's key. And, when we think about the overarching idea here of intergenerational conversation and how that can shape real dialogue and maybe understanding, and how that might be a model that we would love to see more of around and about in culture and society and these times, as you mentioned, these sort of perilous times. That model is so meaningful to me because, even though we agree and have shared interests about so many things, we can't possibly come to view things in the same way.
Right.
Having 40 years between us, right? So it's been a really wonderful discovery to see how that we can engage with each other at a very deep level, but also respect each other's differences and learn from each other. And so that's really a lot of what inspires our work here and our talking here and our goals for this endeavor. I know we've talked about a lot of people over the years of our relationship, but we've had a lot of conversations about celebrities and
Yes.
politicians and academics and all of those things. But I want to narrow it down for a moment and ask you to talk about, pick somebody that you consider sort of a cultural heroine. And what is it about that person that we're going to stick with women here, okay?
Yes, because this podcast is women run and women owned.
So what appeals to you about that person? Who is she, and why do you choose her?
Oh man, where do I even begin? The first woman icon who comes to mind for me in this conversation is Elizabeth Grant, also known as Miss Lana Del Rey.
Ah, yes.
More famously so. For all the girlies my age out there, and not just limiting it to that, but I feel like I have sensed on social media that my generation of young women.
Your fur baby is crying.
My fur baby as well. Little Mr. Sawyer also feels very passionately about Lana Del Rey. Anyway, she has just become such an icon for me because she captures what it feels like to be a young woman, the freedom and the pain that comes with that, and it's the lyricism and the poetry in which she comes from. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. And not only does her artistic work speak like that to me, but just even her online presence, her stage presence, everything. She's one of those people that I just see does not give a fuck about what anybody has to say about her or her art or anything like that.
You've seen her in concert then?
I have not. I almost did at Lollapalooza this last year. And it was painful, truly painful that I did not get to see her. I waited too long to get tickets, as per usual. But in videos that I've seen of her circulating the web of her tour happening this fall, she is just, in my mind, she is the divine feminine, and she embodies that on this stage. And I love her. I love her. And it's kind of hard for me to put my love for her into words. Maybe I've done that well enough already, but whenever I was preparing for this, I wanted to see what kind of scholarship was out there. I don't know if you would consider the Rolling Stones scholarship, but
cultural commentary for sure.
Absolutely. I just wanted to throw this article out there by Hannah Ewens called Lana Del Rey, She Does It for the Girls. And there is one quote from this article that I feel like puts into words really well, what part of what it is that she does for me. So I just wanted to read that really quickly. It's very brief.
Sure.
But, okay. Quote, "Plenty of girls who were drawn to the idea of being looked after by a divine plan grow up to become women who exist with the exclusive purpose of knowing an all-encompassing romantic love. An impassioned relationship offers escape from the grayscale existence of living out the complicated family dynamics they typically grew up with. Del Rey announced herself as one of these women with her first artistic statement. They say that the world was built for two, only worth living if somebody is loving you." End quote. And I was just like, damn, that is so true. Literally so true. And
talk about what that means to you.
I feel like whenever they're talking about being looked after by a divine plan, growing up as a young woman in a religious context for me, which I know we will get into in this episode a little bit later, but feeling from a very young age that romantic love with a man was a very important thing to accomplish. I feel like that is something that comes through her lyrics and her art a lot. And a lot of people will probably say that she's a little bit problematic for that in some ways because of the way that she does kind of romanticize this like this tragically glamorous kind of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's something that I really resonate with, being someone who who has been drawn to men who perhaps might not be good for me or society's idea of good for me. And additionally, where she talks about or this quote where it talks about like living out the complicated family dynamics that these young women typically grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, relationships with men in my family has been something interesting to deal with. And I feel like a lot of that also does play out in the way that I try to find romantic love.
It seems like you're saying she sort of encapsulates that for you, and she brings it together through her lyrics, and those threads of themes that you've just mentioned are just part of her whole persona and performance. Am I hearing you right on some of that?
Yes. It's like a very like old Hollywood. Does that make sense? It's a
Sure.
very old Hollywood type of vibe, and I'm
Yeah.
really drawn to that.
Well, and you sent me a song or two of hers, and I, learned of her from you, which is one of the things I love about a relationship. And the song was, I don't even remember the name of it now, but it really hit me deeply. I remember at the time, and I was just even noticing the quote you've shared, where you say, "Plenty of girls who were drawn to the idea of being looked after by a divine plan grew up to become women who exist with an exclusive purpose of knowing an all-encompassing romantic love." Now, I read that, and I'm interested in that, and we'll maybe probe that more in other ways throughout this process of creating pods, but I do like that analysis of the Rolling Stone author that you mentioned, because you said Hannah Ewens. So I just think that there's an interesting connection she's drawing there. I'm not an expert on Lana Del Rey, of course, certainly nothing close to what your fandom is obviously very deep, but the idea of looking to a divine father. And, as we talk about religion in a few moments and our relationship with religion itself, that really resonates with me, because I do think that there can be sometimes in religion, particularly depending on how your religion is brought to you, it can create some expectations even about romantic love and the kind of relationship you do have with the opposite sex. So I'm intrigued by that comment. That's more than what you were saying, and it's more than maybe what you meant. But that one jumped out at me, knowing you and knowing me, and then also what you're describing about this artist. So that's really
I'll send you the article after we're done here.
Why, certainly. I'd be happy for more than just a quote here. So, great.
Yeah, and the song that you're referencing that I sent to you a few months ago is "Hope is a dangerous thing for a woman like me to have," with a dash, but I have it. The important thing is that we have it.
Yes, I do remember that title so well now that you say it. I can't believe it slipped out of my mind. It's been a few months since we talked about that, but it was beautiful. So I applaud your choice. I'm with you.
Thank you. Well, but now I'm curious. Who is your cultural heroine of choice?
Well, I am very drawn to Gloria Steinem. May not come as a surprise to you.
Not at all.
I think many women of multiple generations admire Gloria Steinem for the work she's done now for decades. And I've chosen her not because she might seem the obvious choice, but really because given the way I was raised, she would be the least obvious choice. And that gets into the religion a bit. She's the same age as my mom. She was born the same year as your grandmother, my mother. But in growing up in the household and the family that I was born into, with the particular brand of religious tradition that we had, Gloria Steinem was vilified. She was by the time I was starting to pay attention a little bit to what was going on in the world, I was still a very young girl, but around the time that feminist rights were being, the fight for ERA and the work being done to try to create more rights for women was really being spearheaded by women like Gloria Steinem and many others that she worked with. We were hearing about those efforts, and certainly people in my world were trying to sabotage, or at least trying to dismiss them and say that, the ERA, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, is not good for women. It's going to put them in danger. They'll be serving in the military, and they'll be, they won't get a lot of rights that they have now if this happens. And there were all those kinds of conversations happening. And I know that not because I remember all of those conversations, but because I did keep some of the archives of pamphlets that were given to me as a child, and
as a historian, so that's what you
do. Yes. And so, but I do remember the sense that these feminists were going to take over the world and ruin, motherhood and the family and bring us all down. So it's really not as obvious as it might seem, because I did grow up in an era where a lot of women my age, I'm 62, a lot of women my age would say, why, sure, of course, Gloria Steinem is all of our heroes. But I came to know her late, if you will. In fact, it's only been in really the last several years, I studied theater history very deeply, and then, it brought me more and more into feminist scholarship as well. So it wasn't even the first thing in my, pulling away, and doing more academic research and scholarly work that I found her. So by the time I read the memoir that she had written, My Life on the Road, was written, I think, in 2016, 2017 is when it came out. It was just a revelation to me to hear about all the things that she had done and realize what they had done for me. So I could have used her wisdom so much earlier, but it wasn't there for me, probably when I needed it most, given the time, the context and the circumstances of my life at various points. So I would just name her as sort of a latecomer. From my standpoint, I'm a latecomer to being a fan of hers. But she, I think, is almost more important to me in that regard than she might have been had I sort of taken her work and her presence for granted all those years ago. So.
Right. I think it's very interesting that she becomes such an important cultural heroine for you at a later point in your life. As you were saying, probably in the time that you needed her most is a time where you were not familiar with her. I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you think that, like, coming to her, acknowledging the importance of her in your life has made a difference to you in any way?
Well, I think it's helped me analyze some of the things I was taught at a different level. I mentioned her memoir, and because it was, in addition to all of her other writings and just knowing about the work she's done, and there's been so much written about her now because she's had such a long, storied career. But that memoir for me started to make me think, because it was full of times and dates and places and journeys that she had taken throughout her years, especially in the part that was perhaps most interesting to me were the years where she talks about the early feminist movement, or the second wave feminist movement, we now call it. But when it was in the 70s, I was, still very much a very young woman, young girl, starting to become a young woman, and all of the things that I needed to know about how to assert myself, how to be, confident in my own judgment, and how to stand up for myself. Those are the kinds of things that I think would have been so helpful for me to think about from a feminist perspective. And that they were shut off to me. And I started thinking as I read that book, where was I at this moment? And I actually looked at old calendars and started mapping my own journey. I even thought about, I haven't yet done it. I may someday. I thought about sort of mapping my own timeline against hers because in part because I think it would provide such an interesting contrast. As we know today, there's such a fractured society that we're a part of, and this that was true then. There was a lot of upheaval, a lot of right left politics that were pulling against each other, and people were just really struggling to find unity and dialogue of any kind that was meaningful, that could create good change. And so when I look at what I was going through, I've thought, well, if there were sort of two pathways that you saw, two trains running, so to speak, it might be interesting. Here I am. I'm probably doing a Bible quiz practice, studying, memorizing verses, and learning about how good girls behave, and then out there in the world there are these strong women saying, no, we should have equal pay.
Equal rights who? I don't think so.
So we've talked about favorite cultural heroines. I'm going to ask you about another favorite. We're both such art fans and theater fans, and you've talked a little bit about, of course, the arts with Lana Del Rey as your cultural icon of choice, heroine of choice. But what other work of art or music or whatever form of art it is you want to talk about, what would you say would be a favorite artwork that comes to mind?
As of right now, something that's been on my mind a lot, has been the play by Oscar Wilde called Salome. Just got a huge freaking tattoo on my thigh in honor of it and the impact that I feel it's made on me. But yeah, I believe it was written in 1893. And with the release of this play, there was a series of art released by Aubrey Beardsley that kind of illustrated different key points in the play as it went along. But for me, I guess I stumbled upon this play whenever I was doing a research paper about, it was for a seminar class that we lovingly titled The Monster Movies Seminar Class, talking about different cultural fears and how they appear in art, film, literature, any form of entertainment. And Salome, with my topic being the concept of the female gaze and the male gaze and the contrast that they have, came up for me, and I obsessed over this play for a while, just with how much I think, well, there's a lot of things, but the thing that mostly sticks with me about Salome is just how much of a badass she is. For me, she's a symbol of like women's liberation in a way, just because she throughout the play, she is consistent and persistent in what she wants until the very end. And although she is a very highly sexualized object of the male gaze, she finds a way to embrace her freedom, I think, within that male gaze by knowing how to wield her power that she sees that she has over the men in this play. I think another aspect of it is how it takes biblical subject matter and mixes it with the grotesque. That is something I have experienced in my own life, religion and grotesqueness. But if I may just quickly pull a quote from the play that as I was going over my notes, felt like really spoke to me in what it is about her as a character that just lights a fire within. So towards the end of the play, she says, It's also important to quickly preface that her unrequited love interest is John the Baptist, also known as Yochanan in the play. And she says, "What shall I do now, Yochanan? Neither the floods nor the great waters can quench my passion. I was a princess, and thou didst scorn me. I was a virgin, and thou did take my virginity from me. I was chaste, and thou did fill my veins with fire. Wherefore did thou not look at me, Yochanan? If thou hadst looked at me, thou hadst loved me. Well, I know that thou would have loved me, and the mystery of love is greater than the mystery of death." And the funny thing is that, if anything, John the Baptist, Yochanan, did not do any of that. He rejected her consistently and did not want her. Yet she has this fantasy, this daydream of them together. And I guess I really resonate with that sense of unrequited love. Now that I'm saying it out loud like that, I guess maybe that's kind of what I feel I really resonate with her about. But yeah, in a very long-winded response to that, it's Salome by Oscar Wilde with the art of Ari Beardsley that goes along with that. It's just beautiful. I love it.
Well, I love it that you chose a play to start with, and also one that, one of my favorite historical time periods to study in terms of its complexity with regard especially to the way women were sort of contained and encapsulated and coded is the Victorian era and the early 20th century as well, which does include a little bit of the Victorian era. But I do think that that's an interesting mix for me. I haven't read that play recently. I remember it being a scandalous production, one of the ones that I had read about in some of my own research, that when it was produced created quite some scandal because of her, passionate look and the way she was even dressed in the staging of the play. But I can see what pulls you in with the storyline. Of course, it does have the biblical threads to it too, which so much of theater literature and so much of literature early, especially literature, does draw from biblical themes. Or if you look back to the Greek plays, of course, so much of religion and theater are, their histories are intertwined. And this play is a good example of that, it seems to me, too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Victorian period and how this came out during then. That's something that came up in my research paper as well, with it being, I guess I used it as an example of how men at the time could have perceived, or I guess not just men, but society at large could have perceived that women coming into their freedom in the way that Salome does could be highly dangerous for men, perhaps even for women, because spoiler alert, she does in fact die at the end because of the way that she finally gets what she wants, which is a kiss from John the Baptist, from his severed head. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's often, I don't think I came up with this joke, but I always liked it whenever we would read and talk about 19th century Victorian literature. It was always, welcome to the 19th century. Whenever the woman dies at the end, it was like, or even in more current times when the woman is punished by dying at the end. It's welcome to the 19th century.
Yeah, literally stoned to death. But yeah, that's my answer. What about you, Miss Girl?
Well, it may not come as a surprise to you, but I think I'm going to go with a play too. Although I will say we do have broader artistic and literary interests than plays, but it just so happens,
believe it or not,
it just so happens that when it comes to this particular kind of question, I do immediately come up with the play by Henrik Ibsen. He's a Norwegian playwright, very famous for having written A Doll's House or A Doll House, whichever you prefer. That was a play that he's known especially for. His realistic writing was quite innovative at the time, and he's known as the father of realism. Anyway, he wrote a play called Ghosts that I didn't encounter or read word for word, at least, until I was in grad school. And so it was quite it really hit me hard. The story of the play itself is very interesting, and I won't go into all of that. for the sake of time, but there was a primary character named Mrs. Alving who has been for many years throughout a toxic marriage been advised, counseled by her pastor to stay in this toxic marriage, and saying to her that it would be immoral essentially for her to leave. So when I read the play and read through all their dialogue, their discourse together, it was all very striking. But then when I came across this one line, it was something that I just recognized, this is what's happening to me. And I will always use it as the primary metaphor of a very major part of my life trajectory. But the quote is when she says to him, when he's still trying to get her to honor her husband, who by the time the play opens has passed, she says, "Yes, when you forced me under the yoke of what you called duty and obligation, when you lauded as right and proper what my whole soul rebelled against as something loathsome, it was then that I began to look into the seams of your doctrines. I wanted only to pull at a single knot, but when I had got that undone, the whole thing unraveled." So let that sit for a minute.
Let that soak in.
Yeah. And, again, we've already mentioned a few times in our conversation the role that religion has played in our lives, and the preacher's daughter business that is a part of our identities. And I just think as we close out here, I guess it maybe would be a great place to land, I think, for this first, let's get to know us and let everyone know, kind of where we're coming from. Could you talk about quickly a synopsis of your own religious history and, where you feel, are you with it? Are you departed from it? Just a bit about your journey, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes. Oh, the journey. Well, as you mentioned, preacher's daughter. My dad has been a pastor for my whole life, and that growing up, I always, of course, being a child, I had to go to church with my parents, but then even getting older, and even now as an adult, going home to visit my parents, I've always felt compelled to go to church with them and just still be a part of that. And I guess to back up a little bit, I was in Bible quizzing whenever I was a child and studied the scriptures as a good little girl would do. And yeah, it's always been a big part of my home life. But the older that I get and the more departed from it that I get, I'm starting to realize and feel that I've never really felt as connected to it as I might have performed, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think that a big part of that unraveling for me has been in large part to the education that I have received since I left home after graduating high school and going to a liberal arts college. I guess specifically just like not only opening my worldview to the different world religions that exist, but also just critical thinking skills and being able to come to conclusions on my own that have been outside of the realm of sitting in a church pew and listening to the man at the pulpit speak to me about the interpretation of these scriptures and such things. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can really describe the place that I've landed at now with religion. I definitely would not consider myself a religious person, but I still feel a connection to spirituality. Spirituality at least, and believing that perhaps there is something beyond this life that we live here on the earthly plane. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely not something that I spend my time thinking about and fretting over as I did and as I had as a 12-year-old girl in Bible quizzing, for example. So yeah, sure. It's a very interesting and fraught relationship that I have with religion now. But
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I can definitely relate. I mean, in sort of response to that, I think our journeys are different on that. Not in some ways. You mentioned Bible quizzing, and so did I. And I realized that both of us have said that fairly casually, as though people might know what that is. And probably very few would know, but we don't have time to get into all the details of it. But there's a sort of a sport of trivia, Bible trivia type sport that is very popular in certain religious traditions. So that's something that children often grow up in as a part of their church education. And
sort of Jeopardy style,
yeah.
I guess is the first thing I think
sort
of. Very
yes.
Jeopardy-esque.
Yes. So anyway, another day for that. But I do, want to just be transparent that, we both come out of the same, my parents started the family tradition, even for them in their generations. They were the first generation members of, well, I consider a fundamentalist, but certainly evangelical religion that had taught them some very specific things about the Bible and God and all of those the ways that one should live one's life in often a very narrow perspective. But so I was raised with a very intense upbringing, religiously speaking. And it's funny that my brother, your dad, is still within that religion, and I no longer am. But I've seen you come up in that faith, regardless of what degree you embraced it or not. I do know that you were raised differently than me, and that for you to realize at some point that you didn't have quite as intense of a connection to it as maybe you had been performing doesn't completely surprise me, not because you weren't a good actress, but just because it felt different for me when I was around your home. But in my home, my family of origin, we were very intensely raised, going to the mission field, and the evangelical impulse was ingrained in us. The idea of saving souls from heaven and for heaven, and saving people from hell was very literally taught. A process. We were taught to try to win people to Christ, and so ultimately, though, I just because there's no time now, and certainly in one episode, to cover all that a lifetime brings you of understanding about yourself in these ways. I would just say that my religion, probably the things that they intended to teach me, my parents included, as well as the church that they belonged to and worked for, the things that they intended to teach me and what my takeaways were ultimately were very, very far apart. By that, I mean, I was taught to be very moral, to be good. And my takeaway was that one has to adhere to a set of rules, and instead of learning the ways that life's going to come at you in waves and knock you over. And,
right.
and I mean, it is sort of like I guess using, say, a swimming metaphor, I think that I was taught sort of how to swim in swimming class, right? And how to do a certain kind of stroke, and in a very specific amount of water and under certain conditions. And then when you find yourself in a life that's really more of an ocean and you're being battered against rocks, it doesn't matter what swimming stroke in some situations like that. So it just felt like that. Another, for me, I was taught very much to aspire towards what we called Christian perfection. I don't know if you grew up hearing that term, but the takeaway for me was that, it's not sustainable really to be perfect and to try for perfection. And so ultimately, without going into so much depth that it's going to bore everyone to tears on the end of this episode, but ultimately, religion has not been a sustainable practice for me. I tried to find other ways of practicing religion, but you're right, combining that with certain critical thinking about what religion teaches more generally, not just my faith, the faith of origin, but most religions, the kinds of things that are taught. Many good things. I mean, I do believe that there were things that I was taught in my faith and in my family that was so faith-oriented that have helped me in life, and I am very grateful for those things. But it's also been a big struggle for me to overcome a lot of the negativity that was taught me in the name of religion. So that's where I am right now. Sort of, it may not seem like a short summary, but I've given it a lot of thought. So I did the best I could. And
that's the story so far.
So far, yes. Yes. Well, we have talked at some depth and sometimes not so much depth. It's been a great conversation, and I'm so looking forward to getting our chance to do this again in our next episode. But before we go, do you have anything else you'd like to say? I'm feeling ready to move along and go to my own fur. Well, maybe that too, but I've got a fur baby who would like to talk to me now too. I think my little dog Rizzo is.
And my fur baby Sawyer has been talking to me.
Yes, I've heard him a few times. I didn't quite let Rizzo in the room, but I know he's right at the top of the stairs, just waiting,
anxiously waiting for his mommy to return. I guess the closing thought that I have to say is, I'll pray for you, girl.
Well, after that long summary of my religious, not so well-being, yes, I think you need to.
Not so well-being is a perfect way to describe it.
All right.
Well, I guess that's all for now.
It sure is. Okay, you have a great night.
You too, girl. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.